He lived with his wife for 55 years, but just days before his death, he learned a truth that changed everything. A secret hidden for decades turned his view of the past upside down. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Frank sat in his worn-out armchair by the window, watching the golden leaves fall from the oak tree in their backyard. The autumn breeze carried a crisp scent through the small town of Middleton, Ohio, a place where he and Margaret had spent their entire lives together. Their house, modest yet filled with warmth, bore the marks of time. Scratches on the wooden floors from when their children used to play, faded wallpaper that neither of them had the energy to replace, and shelves filled with decades' worth of memories. For 55 years, Frank and Margaret had lived what many would call an ideal life. They had raised 2 children, seen them build families of their own, and now spent their days in quiet companionship enjoying their golden years. They had their routines: morning coffee on the porch, slow walks in the park, Sunday visits from their daughter Kate and her children. Frank believed he knew his wife better than anyone. They had shared joys, sorrows, and everything in between. Yet, in recent weeks, he noticed something different about her. Margaret had become more distant, lost in thought, as if she carried a burden too heavy to share. He often found her staring at old photo albums, her fingers tracing the edges of pictures as though trying to reach into the past. At night, he would wake up and see her sitting in the dim light of their bedroom, clutching a small, worn-out envelope in her lap. When he asked what was wrong, she would simply shake her head, forcing a weak smile before returning to bed. Frank tried not to pry, but the change unsettled him. Margaret was not the type to keep secrets. They had built their marriage on honesty, trusting each other through thick and thin. But something about the way she avoided his gaze, the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't looking, told him that whatever was on her mind was something she had buried for a long time. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Margaret broke the silence. "I need to tell you something," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank set down his newspaper and turned to her, sensing the weight in her tone. Her hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles pale from the pressure. "I should have told you this years ago," she continued, her voice shaken, "but I was afraid, and now I don't know if I can live with this secret any longer." Frank felt his chest tighten. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but he remained silent, waiting. Margaret took a deep breath, then exhaled shakily. "Before we were married, when you were in the army—" She paused, looking down at her lap, unable to meet his eyes. "I was pregnant." The words hit Frank like a blow to the chest. His breath caught, and for a moment the crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room. "But we didn't," he started, but the truth had already settled in his heart before he could finish the thought. "It wasn't yours," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. A cold wave of shock washed over him. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Margaret had always been faithful. Always, or at least he had believed so. She finally looked up, and in her eyes he saw something deeper than guilt, remorse, sorrow, and a pain that had lingered for decades. "When you left for the army, I was lost. I missed you so much, and I was scared you wouldn't come back. I made a terrible mistake, Frank." She swallowed hard. "And then I found out I was pregnant. I was so ashamed. I didn't know what to do." Frank felt the weight of her words pressing against his chest. His hands clenched into fists, then relaxed, then clenched again. 100 emotions surged through him: anger, sadness, disbelief. "What happened to the baby?" he asked finally, his voice strained. Margaret blinked back tears. I gave him up for adoption." He stared at her, trying to process everything. The woman he had loved for more than half a century had carried this secret their entire marriage. A son he never knew existed, taken away before he even had a chance to be a part of his life. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Margaret whispered. "I thought if I let him go, I could give you the life you deserved. I was terrified you would leave me if you knew." Frank exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He felt as if the ground beneath him had been pulled away. His entire life, everything he had believed about their marriage, about Margaret, had been built on an illusion. He stood up, unable to sit still. He paced to the window, staring out into the darkness. The leaves continued to fall, indifferent to the storm raging inside him. "You never thought to tell me?" he finally asked. His voice was not angry, but filled with a quiet pain. Margaret let out a shuddering breath. "I was afraid." And as the years passed, it became harder and harder to say it. The secret became part of me. Frank turned back to look at her. The woman he had trusted with his whole heart had kept something so monumental from him. And yet, he saw the agony in her face, the years of suffering she had endured in silence. He wanted to scream, to demand why she had never told him the truth. But at the same time, he knew that no answer could change what had already been done. Margaret hesitated, then reached for a small wooden box on the coffee table. She opened it with trembling hands, revealing a faded photograph of a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. The edges of the picture were worn, as if it had been touched and held countless times over the years. "This is him," she whispered. "Our son." Frank stared at the photo, his heart pounding. The baby had round cheeks, soft wisps of hair, and a tiny hand curled into a fist. A stranger, yet somehow a part of his wife, a part of the life he never knew existed. He felt his legs weaken and sank back into the chair, staring at the photograph. A son. A lifetime lost. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Where is he now?" Margaret wiped her eyes, her breath unsteady. "I don't know." The words hit him just as hard as the confession itself. For decades, this child had been out there somewhere, growing up, living his own life, completely unaware of the parents who had brought him into the world. Frank swallowed, his thoughts racing. His world had just been turned upside down, and yet something inside him whispered that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. Frank barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess of emotions he couldn't untangle. His wife, his Margaret, had lied to him for over 50 years. She had carried this secret while they built their lives together, raised their children, shared everything. Or, at least, he had believed they had shared everything. The truth burned in his chest like a slow fire. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, he sat up and glanced over at Margaret. She was asleep, curled up on her side, her face peaceful in the dim morning glow. But now he knew there was a part of her past that had remained untouched by him. He had always thought they had faced everything together. He had been wrong. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and rubbed his hands over his face. The weight of her revelation pressed against him, suffocating. For the first time in decades, he felt like a stranger in his own home. The scent of coffee filled the kitchen when he finally made his way downstairs. He sat at the worn wooden table, staring at the mug in front of him, his fingers curled around it but not drinking. Margaret entered the kitchen quietly. He didn't look up. She hesitated, then poured herself a cup and sat across from him. Neither of them spoke at first. The only sounds were the faint tick of the clock on the wall and the birds outside, singing as if the world hadn't just collapsed around them. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "Frank," she said softly. He lifted his gaze, meeting her tired eyes. He could see how much it had cost her to tell him the truth, but that didn't ease the ache inside him. "I need to understand," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret exhaled, gripping the handle of her coffee cup as if it could anchor her. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd leave me. Afraid you'd never look at me the same way." Frank let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And what do you think I'm doing now?" She flinched. He hadn't meant to be cruel, but the words had come out harsher than he intended. "I didn't know how to tell you, Frank," she continued, her voice breaking. "At first, I thought I would. But then you came back from the army, and I saw how happy you were to see me. You had this whole future planned for us, and I—" She swallowed. "I couldn't destroy it." Frank closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost picture them back then, young, naive, standing on the train platform when he returned, his heart full of dreams about their future. And all that time, she had been hiding this from him. His hands clenched into fists. "And the baby? You just gave him away?" Margaret's breath hitched. "I thought it was the best thing for him. I had no money, no family support. My parents would have disowned me if they had found out. And I couldn't—" She pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to steady herself. "I couldn't bear the thought of you coming home and leaving me if I told you the truth. So I did the only thing I thought I could." Frank shook his head slowly. He wasn't sure if he could understand it, if he could accept it. After a long silence, he finally asked the question that had been gnawing at him all night. "Do you regret it?" Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "Every single day." Frank took a slow breath, his heart heavy. He had thought he knew his wife better than anyone, but now he was looking at a woman who had carried an entirely different life inside her. And worse, she had done it alone. As much as the betrayal stung, another thought lodged itself in his mind, persistent and inescapable. A son. Somewhere out there, he had a son he had never known. Margaret seemed to sense the shift in him. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Frank, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to understand. But I told you because I couldn't carry it anymore. And if you want to find him, I won't stop you." He looked at her carefully, searching for any hint of hesitation. "Do you want to find him?" She nodded, though her expression was filled with fear. "I don't know if he'd even want to know me, but I need to know if he's okay, if he had a good life." Frank leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He was exhausted. But beneath the exhaustion there was a pull, an ache to do something with this revelation, to find the missing piece of his life. He looked at the small wooden box she had shown him the night before. Inside, the faded photograph of the baby seemed to stare up at him, as if waiting to be acknowledged. Finally, he exhaled. "I want to find him," he said. Margaret swallowed hard. "Then I'll help you." For a long time, they sat there in silence. The storm between them hadn't passed, and Frank wasn't sure if it ever truly would. But for now, they had a new purpose. A new search had begun. The decision had been made, but Frank had no idea where to start. A lifetime had passed since Margaret had given up their son, and the only clues they had were buried in the fragile yellowing documents stored inside the wooden box. He spent the next morning going through them at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing the faded ink of a birth certificate, an adoption record, and a few old letters Margaret had written but never sent. Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded together as if she were praying. She had already told him everything she remembered, that the baby had been placed with a family in New York through a private adoption agency. She hadn't been allowed to know where he went after that. All she had was the name of the agency and the date of the adoption. Frank studied the papers again, frustration simmering inside him. "It's not much to go on," he muttered. Margaret nodded. "I know." For a moment, he considered what to do next. He had never tried to track someone down before, let alone someone who had been adopted over 50 years ago. This was a world he knew nothing about. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let the trail go cold. That afternoon, Frank drove into town and found a small, aging office with a faded sign that read, "Henderson and Associates, Private Investigations." It wasn't the kind of place he had ever imagined himself stepping into, but he needed help. The investigator, a middle-aged man named Greg Porter, listened patiently as Frank explained the situation. He studied the documents Frank had brought, flipping through them with a trained eye. "This won't be easy," Porter said, leaning back in his chair. "Records from private adoptions back then weren't always well kept, and even if we find a name, your son might not want to be found." Frank exhaled. "I understand. I need to try." Porter nodded. "All right. We'll start with the adoption agency. They might not give out information freely, but there are ways to dig." He paused. "Are you prepared for any outcome, even if he refuses to meet you?" Frank hesitated, then nodded. "I just need to know that he's out there, that he had a good life." Porter agreed to take the case, warning that it could take weeks, maybe even months, to get answers. But Frank was willing to wait. The first few days were agonizingly slow. Porter made calls, filed requests, and searched through databases, but everything seemed locked behind layers of bureaucracy. Some records had been lost over time and others were legally sealed. Every time Frank's phone rang, he felt a surge of hope, only to hear that they had hit another dead end. Margaret watched him closely. She knew he wasn't sleeping well. The weight of the secret she had kept for decades was now pressing down on him, too. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Margaret quietly said, "If we don't find him, will you be able to live with that?" Frank didn't answer right away. He stared at the flickering fire, thinking about the son he had never known. "I don't know," he admitted. A week passed, then another, and then, just when Frank began to fear they had reached a dead end, Porter called with news. "I found something," he said. Frank gripped the phone tightly. "What is it?" "The adoption agency's records show that the boy was placed with a couple named Robert and Helen Harris in New York. They legally changed his name after the adoption. His birth name is gone from most official records, but I managed to track down a trail." Frank's heart pounded. "And?" Porter exhaled. "Your son's name is David Harris. He's still in New York, and from what I've found, he's a lawyer, a pretty successful one." Frank sat down heavily, his mind swirled with the reality of what he had just learned. His son, his own flesh and blood, was alive, thriving, and completely unaware of his existence. Porter's voice softened. "I have an address for his law firm. It's in Manhattan. But Frank, I need to warn you. Just because we found him doesn't mean he'll want to see you." Frank gripped the arm of the chair. "I understand." Margaret was watching him, her face pale. When he hung up the phone, she whispered, "You found him?" Frank nodded. "I found him." Silence stretched between them. Margaret covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Frank swallowed hard. "Now, I go to New York." The train ride to New York felt longer than it should have. Frank sat by the window, watching the scenery shift from the open countryside of Ohio to the dense industrial outskirts of the East Coast. The steady hum of the train and the occasional rattle of the tracks did little to quiet his thoughts. He had never been a man to make impulsive decisions, but this time he had acted on instinct. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for. He wasn't sure if David would even speak to him, but now that he had come this far, there was no turning back. Margaret had stood by the doorway when he left that morning, her hands clasped together, a silent prayer in her eyes. She had wanted to come with him, but Frank had told her no. This was something he needed to do alone. She hadn't argued. She understood that this moment, this decision, belonged to him. When he stepped off the train at Penn Station, the city greeted him with its unrelenting noise. The rush of people, the screech of brakes, the overwhelming mass of movement made him feel like a visitor from another era. New York had always been a place of motion, of progress, of people too busy chasing something to stop and look around. He clutched the slip of paper with David's office address and took a slow breath. It had been a long time since he had last set foot in this city. He took a cab to the address Porter had given him. The law firm was located in a towering glass building in the heart of Manhattan, the kind of place that made a man feel small just by looking at it. As he stepped out of the cab, he found himself hesitating for the first time. He had spent weeks preparing for this, but now, standing in front of those heavy revolving doors, he felt a pang of doubt. What if David wanted nothing to do with him? What if he had built a life so far removed from the past that there was no space left for answers? He forced himself to move. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced at him as she answered phones and shuffled through papers. When he asked for David Harris, she gave him a polite but distant look before typing something into her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" Frank hesitated. "No, but I'm sorry," she cut in smoothly, barely looking up. "Mr. Harris doesn't take walk-ins." Frank exhaled. He had expected as much, but he had hoped for more. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the envelope he had prepared, and slid it across the counter. "Could you just make sure he gets this?" She hesitated, but finally nodded, setting the envelope aside. Frank stepped back, glancing once more at the massive office space beyond the glass partitions. Somewhere in there was the son he had never known. And now, all he could do was wait. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. He stayed in a small hotel near Central Park, keeping his phone within reach at all times. Every time it rang, his pulse quickened, only to drop when it was Margaret or the front desk calling about some triviality. He walked through the city aimlessly, watching strangers hurry past, wondering if David had read his letter, if he had even given it a second glance before tossing it away. On the fourth day, just as he had begun to consider returning home, his phone rang again, a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, calm and composed, spoke on the other end. "This is David Harris. I got your letter." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. His throat felt suddenly dry. "I see," he managed to say. There was a pause. "Meet me tomorrow," David said. 12 o'clock, Washington Square Park. and then the line went dead. Frank lowered the phone slowly, staring out at the city around him. The moment he had been waiting for was finally here. He was going to meet his son. Frank arrived at Washington Square Park half an hour early. He had never been good at waiting, and now, with his nerves running high, he needed the extra time to gather himself. The park was lively, filled with students from the nearby university, tourists taking pictures, and musicians playing soft melodies under the arch. The scene felt almost surreal compared to the storm inside him. He found a bench with a clear view of the fountain and sat down, gripping his hands together to keep them steady. His mind replayed every possible scenario. Would David be angry? Dismissive? Would he even stay to listen? Frank had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now that the moment was upon him, all the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How did you explain 55 years of absence in a single conversation? At exactly noon, a tall, well-dressed man approached. Frank knew it was him before he even spoke. David moved with confidence, his suit crisp, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He had Margaret's eyes, deep and intelligent, though there was a guardedness in them that Frank had not expected. Frank stood, feeling suddenly aware of his own frailty, the weight of his years pressing against him. David stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, studying him as if trying to decide what to make of the man in front of him. "You're Frank, I assume?" David's voice was calm but distant. Frank nodded. "Yes. Thank you for meeting me." David didn't sit down. He glanced around as if considering whether this was worth his time. "I don't know what you expect from this," he said finally. "I'm not sure why you even reached out." Frank took a slow breath. He had known this wouldn't be easy. "I don't expect anything," he said carefully. "I just wanted to see you, to tell you the truth. After all these years, I thought you deserved that much." David let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "The truth? And what exactly is the truth?" Frank hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Your mother, Margaret, she kept your existence a secret from me. I only found out a few weeks ago. If I had known back then, things might have been different." David's expression didn't change. "That's convenient," he said, his tone measured but sharp. "You find out about me now, at the end of your life, and suddenly you want to track me down. Why? To ease your conscience?" Frank flinched at the accusation, though he knew it was deserved. He couldn't blame David for being guarded. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Frank admitted. "I don't even expect you to believe me. But I needed to try. Not for me, for you, for your mother." At the mention of Margaret, something flickered in David's expression, but it was gone before Frank could grasp it. "I don't know anything about her," David said. "I never tried to find my birth parents. My adoptive parents were good to me. I had a normal life. I never felt like I was missing anything." Frank nodded slowly. "I'm glad to hear that. That's all Margaret ever wanted. She gave you up because she thought it was the only way to give you a better life." David's jaw tightened. For the first time, there was something other than coldness in his expression, something like hesitation. "So you came all this way just to tell me that?" Frank met his gaze. "I came because I needed you to know that you weren't forgotten. You were never forgotten. She carried you in her heart for 55 years. And now that I know about you, I carry you too." David exhaled sharply and looked away for a moment. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Finally, he shook his head. "This is a lot," he admitted. "I don't know what to do with it." Frank felt a flicker of hope at that. The door wasn't shut completely. "I don't need you to do anything," Frank said gently. "I just wanted to give you the choice. If you never want to see me again, I'll understand." David didn't respond right away. He looked down at his watch, then back at Frank. "I need to think," he said finally. "I don't know what I want from this, if I want anything at all." Frank nodded. "That's fair." David hesitated, then took a step back. "I'll let you know." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving Frank standing in the middle of the park, watching his son disappear into the crowd. Frank remained in Washington Square Park long after David had disappeared into the crowd. The city moved around him, unbothered by the weight of what had just happened. He sat back down on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, his thoughts tangled in the silence David had left behind. The meeting had gone as well as he had feared and as badly as he had expected. David hadn't turned him away outright, but neither had he embraced this new, unexpected truth. Frank understood. The news had come out of nowhere, shattering a life that, by all accounts, had been whole without him. He knew what it was like to have the ground shift beneath his feet. He had been living in that feeling ever since Margaret's confession. By the time the sun began to dip below the skyline, Frank forced himself to leave the park. He wandered back toward his hotel, his mind replaying the conversation in the park over and over again. He had told David the truth, at least as much of it as he could in such a short meeting, but had it been enough? Or had it only pushed him further away? The hotel room felt emptier than ever when he stepped inside. He sank onto the edge of the bed and rubbed a hand over his face. His body ached, his mind even more so. He glanced at his phone, half expecting a message or a call that wouldn't come. He had told David he wouldn't push, and he meant it, but waiting was its own kind of pain. The next morning, Frank called Margaret. She picked up on the first ring, as if she had been waiting for his call. "How did it go?" Her voice was hesitant, hopeful but afraid. "He came," Frank said. "We talked." There was a long silence. He could picture her gripping the phone, holding her breath. "And?" "He doesn't know what to think yet," Frank admitted. "I can't blame him." Another pause, then a quiet exhale. "Did he ask about me?" Frank hesitated. "Not exactly, but when I mentioned you, I could tell he wanted to know more. He just wasn't ready to ask." Margaret made a small broken sound on the other end of the line. He knew how much she had wanted this, even if she had been too afraid to say it out loud. "He might reach out," Frank continued, "or he might not. I don't know yet." Margaret was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "At least he knows." Frank nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, he knows." The following days stretched endlessly. Frank stayed in the city longer than he had planned, walking through its streets, waiting for something that might never come. He checked his phone more than he cared to admit, but there was no call, no message from David. He tried to convince himself that it was fine, that he had done what he came to do, but part of him still hoped. Then, on the fifth day, just as Frank had resigned himself to going home, his phone finally rang. David. Frank's fingers were steady as he picked up, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Hello?" A pause. Then David's voice, carefully neutral. "I read the letter you left for me." Frank waited, sensing there was more. "I don't know what I expected," David admitted. "I think I wanted it to answer all my questions, but instead, I just have more." Frank nodded to himself. "That makes sense." Another pause, then quieter. "Can we meet again?" Frank closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. "Of course." This time, David chose a quieter place. They met at a small cafe tucked away from the city's usual noise, a place David probably picked so he wouldn't have to feel exposed. When Frank arrived, David was already there, sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when Frank walked in, his expression more composed than before, but there was something different in his eyes, less guarded. Frank sat across from him, waiting for David to speak first. "I have questions," David said, running a hand along the rim of his coffee cup. "I don't even know where to start." Frank nodded. "Ask whatever you need." David hesitated, then finally asked, "Why did she give me away?" Frank had expected this question, but that didn't make answering it any easier. He took a slow breath, measuring his words. "She was young, she was scared, and I was gone." David's expression didn't change, but Frank could tell he was absorbing every word. "She thought she was doing the right thing," Frank continued, "that giving you up would give you the kind of life she couldn't provide. And she was afraid of what would happen if I knew, afraid of what people would say." David studied him. "And what about you? What would you have done if she had told you?" Frank didn't hesitate. "I would have stayed." David didn't look away. "Do you resent her?" Frank considered that. "I did," he admitted. "At first, but not anymore. Not after seeing how much she carried this all these years." David took in this information, his gaze distant. "She never tried to find me?" "She wanted to," Frank said, "but she was afraid she'd ruin your life by showing up." David let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Seems like a pattern with her." Frank didn't respond to that. He knew David had a right to his emotions. This wasn't something that could be resolved in a single conversation. After a long silence, David leaned back. "So, what happens now?" Frank met his gaze. "That's up to you." David looked down at his coffee, his expression unreadable. "I don't know yet." Frank nodded, accepting that. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the years between them still present but no longer insurmountable. It wasn't a resolution, but it was something. When they left the cafe, David hesitated before turning to go. "Tell her—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I don't know, just tell her I know." Frank nodded. "I will." David didn't say anything else. He just nodded and walked away. But this time, as Frank watched him go, he knew the door wasn't closed. Frank returned to Ohio, feeling both exhausted and hopeful. The journey had taken more out of him than he had expected, but there was a lightness in his chest that hadn't been there before. The conversation with David had left things uncertain, but it had also opened a door. Whether that door would remain open, whether David would choose to step through it, was still unknown. But at least it was no longer locked. Margaret was waiting for him at the door when he arrived home. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the past few weeks had drained her. She didn't say anything at first, just searched his face for some sign of what had happened. Frank stepped forward, took her hands in his, and whispered, "He knows." Tears filled her eyes, and she clutched his hands tightly, nodding, unable to speak. Inside, they sat at the kitchen table, just as they had the night she had first told him the truth. Frank told her everything. How David had reacted, the doubts he had, the questions he had asked, and how he had left things uncertain, but not impossible. Margaret listened intently, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed every word. "Did he ask about me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank hesitated, then nodded. "Not directly. But when I talked about you, I could see that he wanted to know more. He just wasn't ready to say it." Margaret exhaled, her fingers tightening around her mug of tea. I don't know if he'll ever want to meet me. Frank reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Give him time. He's just starting to process all of this. A week passed, then another. They heard nothing. Frank tried not to let it weigh on him, but he knew Margaret was struggling with the silence. Every time the phone rang, she would tense slightly, as if bracing herself for news that never came. Then, on a quiet afternoon, the phone did ring. Margaret was in the garden, tending to the flowers she had always loved. Frank was inside, sorting through some old letters when the call came. He saw the unfamiliar number and hesitated before answering. Hello? There was a pause. Then, It's David. Frank straightened, his grip tightened on the phone. David? Another pause. I've been thinking. Frank waited, giving him space. I don't know what I want from this, David admitted. I don't know if I even want a relationship, but I think I want to know more. Frank nodded, his heart steady but hopeful. That's all we could ever ask. David was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, he asked, Is she there? Frank turned toward the window, looking outside at Margaret as she kneeled in the dirt, tending to the roses. The late afternoon sun cast a soft glow over her, making her look almost younger, the way she had in the days when they were first in love. Yes, he said. She's here. Another pause. Then, I think I want to meet her. Frank swallowed, emotion catching in his throat. He knew what this meant. For Margaret, for David, for all of them. I'll tell her, he said. David hesitated. Not yet. I'm not ready for her to call me or anything, but I just wanted you to know. Frank nodded again, even though David couldn't see him. Whenever you're ready. That night, he told Margaret. She covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Frank wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, feeling the relief and fear in the way she clung to him. He wants to meet you, Frank whispered. Not yet, but he will. Margaret nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak. Days passed. Then another call came. This time, David wanted to talk about her. Frank spent hours on the phone with him, telling stories about the woman he had loved for more than 5 decades. He told David about how Margaret had been the most brilliant girl in school, how she had always dreamed of traveling but never got the chance, how she made the best apple pie in town. He told him about the way she laughed, the way she had raised their children, the way she had suffered in silence for so long, carrying the weight of her choices alone. David listened. He didn't always respond, but Frank could tell he was absorbing every word. One evening, Margaret finally gathered the courage to write a letter. She spent hours at the kitchen table, writing and rewriting, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right words. When she was done, she handed it to Frank. I don't know if he'll read it, she said. He will, Frank assured her. A week later, David called again. I got her letter, he said. Frank waited. I still don't know what to do with it, David admitted. You don't have to do anything, Frank said gently. Just knowing is enough. Another silence, then, quietly, She sounds like a good woman. Frank smiled. She is. David exhaled. Okay. Another pause. Tell her I said thank you. Frank nodded. I will. Slowly, piece by piece, something was forming. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't certain, but it was something. A bridge between past and present, between pain and healing. And for the first time in 55 years, Margaret allowed herself to hope. The first meeting between Margaret and David was arranged with careful deliberation, as if both sides were stepping onto fragile ground that could collapse at any moment. It was David who decided on the place, a quiet restaurant outside the city, away from the noise and the rush of his everyday life. He insisted on neutral ground, somewhere neither of them had history with, a place that wouldn't carry the weight of the years between them. Frank and Margaret arrived early. Margaret was uncharacteristically silent on the drive, her hands twisting in her lap, her lips pressed tightly together. Frank could feel the tension radiating from her, but there was nothing he could say to ease it. This was a moment decades in the making, and there was no way to predict how it would unfold. They sat in a booth near the window, waiting. Margaret barely touched the tea she had ordered. She kept glancing toward the entrance, her breath hitching every time someone walked in. Then, finally, David arrived. He looked almost the same as he had the last time Frank had seen him, but now there was something different in his eyes. He was still guarded, still composed, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Margaret stood as he approached, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Frank held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile understanding was forming between them. David was the first to speak. "Hello?" Margaret's voice trembled. "Hello?" It was nothing, and it was everything. David sat across from them, and for the first few minutes the conversation was stiff, full of long pauses and uncertain glances. Margaret kept her hands folded in her lap, as if afraid that if she reached for him, he would disappear. "I don't know where to start," she admitted softly. David exhaled, shaking his head. "Neither do I." Frank remained silent, letting them find their own way. Margaret swallowed. I just want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you, not for a single day." David nodded but didn't respond right away. He was processing, measuring his words before speaking. "I guess I don't know what I expected," he said finally. "Maybe I thought you'd have all the answers." Margaret let out a shaky breath. "I wish I did." For a long time the conversation meandered through safe topics: his childhood, his adoptive parents, his career. Margaret listened intently, soaking in every detail. She didn't ask for anything, didn't demand anything. She just listened. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. After an hour, David glanced at his watch. "I should go," he said, though there was no urgency in his tone. Margaret nodded, trying to hide the disappointment in her eyes. David hesitated, then finally said, "I think I'd like to see you again." Margaret's breath caught. "I would love that." David nodded, offering a small, almost hesitant smile before standing. He looked at Frank then, as if acknowledging his presence for the first time since sitting down. "Take care of her," he said quietly. Frank met his gaze. "Always?" And then, just like that, David was gone. Margaret sat motionless for a long time, staring at the spot where he had been. Then, slowly, she turned to Frank, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He didn't hate me," she whispered. Frank reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "No, he didn't." Something shifted that day. The weight of the past was still there, but it was lighter now, shared between them instead of being carried alone. In the weeks that followed, David kept his word. He called, he sent messages, and eventually he visited again. The conversations were still tentative, still careful, but they were happening, and that was more than Margaret had ever dared to hope for. Frank watched it all unfold with quiet pride. He saw the way Margaret's face lit up whenever David reached out, the way her steps seemed lighter, her laughter less burdened. She would never get back the years she had lost, but she was finding something new, something real. Frank's health had been declining, and he knew it. He felt the exhaustion settling deeper into his bones, the weight of time pressing against him. But he didn't tell Margaret. Not yet. He wanted her to have this, to have these moments without the shadow of loss looming over her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Frank turned to her, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," she said. "For giving me the courage to face this. For standing by me, even when you had every reason to walk away." Frank smiled, squeezing her hand. "I could never walk away from you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long time they sat in silence, watching the sky darken. A few weeks later, Frank's condition worsened. He had known it was coming, but when the time came, he still felt unprepared. Margaret stayed by his side through it all. David came too, sitting quietly in the room, offering his presence even when there were no words left to say. On his final day, as the light outside softened into evening, Frank reached for Margaret's hand. "I'm glad we found him," he whispered. Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Me too." Frank turned his gaze to David, who sat on the other side of the bed. "You have a good mother," he said. David's throat worked as he swallowed. He nodded. "I know." Frank exhaled, feeling a peace he hadn't known in a long time. The weight of unfinished business, of unspoken words, had lifted. His eyes drifted closed, his hand still wrapped around Margaret's. And then, quietly, he was gone. Margaret wept, her fingers tightening around his hand, unwilling to let go. David reached for her then, his grip steady, strong. She turned to him, eyes filled with sorrow, but also with something else, something softer. They had found each other, and somehow that made all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. Check out our other stories for more compelling narratives, and feel free to share this video with others. Thanks for watching.